So the following is the Wisconsin PreTrip, and right here is the memory aid that they'll provide you. So you'll want to look this over because it talks about the in-cab piece here, but it doesn't mention much right here either. And then also, when you look at the front of the vehicle, lights, reflectors, engine compartments, steering components, it doesn't really list all of those pieces, parts and pieces for you. But there's a very simple process to kind of walk through the engine compartments to identify those. And then it's also the rear of the truck, tractor, and lights and reflectors. And then they help you out with the steering axle, driver door, under the vehicle, drive axle, and so on right here. So here at Class A Leasing, we have a study guide right here that will help you along with this Wisconsin PreTrip, but you're not allowed to have this in your, when you're taking your test. You'll just have to memorize this stuff. So for the Wisconsin guys, when you're looking at our setup and all the stuff you have to talk about, because you have to talk about the entire truck, potentially. Now, some examiners, they can choose one axle over the other, because I think in Wisconsin they have an A, B, and C style test, or an A, B, C, and D style test. All that means is that you have to be ready to talk about everything on your setup. And when you look at this, it can be quite intimidating at first, but if you have kind of a strategy or an approach, you'll get through it. The memory aid that you get, and the only piece of paper that you have, is this right here. So there's a lot of memory that you have to do. So when you're looking at certain things, kind of look at it top to bottom, side to side, outside to in, or inside to out. The connection here to the trailer here, clearance there and there, so on and so forth. Outside to in, or here at the brake chambers and the brakes, inside to out, or when you're talking about air and electrics for the tractor and also the trailer, you may want to work inside first, and then outside here, from this way, back out this way. Frame is pretty simple. Talk about the frame here. You'll talk about the frame of the trailer too as well. Working from the ground up, you'll talk about the bud spacing. Talk about the drive shaft and the exhaust system. You could talk about the air tanks underneath the battery box and the fittings and how those air tanks, they're attached. The battery box, the fuel tank, DEF tank, all these steps, the driver's door, tires, hub oil seal, lug nuts, rims. Front of truck. Driver's door and fuel area. Rear or drive axle. Trailer. Combination vehicle. Coupling is the fifth wheel skid plate. The apron, the kingpin, the locking jaw, the release arm. So when you come here at Class A, we'll walk you through all that stuff. You'll get a copy of our old Minnesota PreTrip where we had to talk about the entire truck, and you'll get the memory aid. You'll watch these videos. It's just kind of a general approach to get around this. So a lot of the Wisconsin guys will start from the inside here and work their way out this way when they're talking about the engine compartments or the front of the vehicle. Same with the, what's going on underneath the the vehicle too as well. So there's a lot to cover, but we'll get you through it. So the first thing is the front of the vehicle right here. And as I walk around the front of my vehicle, I'm going to go ahead and kind of take a look and see how it's kind of sitting, or kind of like just parked on the ground here, just to make sure it's not, not sagging at all. It's level with the ground. And everything looks nice and even. I don't see anything that's twisted or sagging at all. And if that were the case, it could be that I could have, a cracked frame member, or a loose or missing cross member, or any number of things. So, like I said, we'll kind of go through all that stuff. And now we're going to talk about things as simple as lights and reflectors. And right now, what I'm going to do is just point out the lights right here and here. There's also a reflector right here and a bulb here, over there, and the headlight bulbs right here and here. And also all the clearance or running lights up on top, and those on the mirrors. And we remember that as this kind of CCC, clean, clear, not cracked. None are loose or missing. Also, there's no loose or hanging wires at all, where the bumper meets the body of the truck right there. And then you can kind of come over this way too as well, and points out that all the wires inside are connected. None of them are loose at all or hanging at all. And they're all securely mounted, and we have the proper color up here, amber. So now we're going to kind of move in and talk about the engine compartment. But before we kind of get there, we're also going to address the mirrors. So when you talk about the mirrors, you'll talk about the arms and how it's mounted to the truck. Also the driver's mirror here too as well. You can point to the other side as well, but you'll address one side. And the assumption will be that the same is true on the passenger side. So starting with the mirrors, the metal here is not twisted or sagging. It's not cracked, bent, or dented. There's no missing nuts or bolts at all. The housing is intact. It's not cracked or loose at all. And the glass here is clean, clear, not cracked. Same is true over here. The arms right here and up there, they're not twisted or sagging at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts at all. The housing too is tight. It's not loose. It's not cracked at all or damaged at all. And the glass here is clean, clear, not cracked. We don't have any loose or missing mirrors at all. The mirrors here and up there are securely mounted. Now we'll move on to the engine compartments, and we'll go through that. So when you're walking through the engine compartments, you're going to want to come up with a systematic approach. In this case, I'm going to work from right to left over here, or you can choose left to right. Just note that about 98% of your pre-trip will be on the driver's side. So there's just a few things over here on the passenger side that you need to point out. And we'll certainly do that. So now we're moving to the engine compartments. Starting on the passenger side, just because there's just a few things here to point out, and I'll do that for you right now. So starting with the water pump, that's that silver pulley. That's right right there, that silver pulley, that's my water pump. So you'll mention that the water pump is not crack bent or dented at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts at all. And it's also not leaking at the seal. And it's belt driven. So the belt is not cut, torn, or frayed. And it's the proper tension. When I push or pull on that belt, there's no more than 3/4 of an inch of play. And then we'll talk about the alternator right here. The alternator, there's a few things. It's attached to the motor with some nuts and bolts in the bracket. Also, it's plugged in right there. And it's electrical, and it's also running off the same drive belt. So we'll mention that the alternator here, it's not sagging or loose. There's no missing nuts or bolts. The bracket has not been broken or cracked at all. The electrical lines, they're plugged in. They're not disconnected at all. There's no cut or exposed wires. Also, they're all tied up. They're not going to get caught on any hot parts or anything. And then you'll mention that the belt here is not cut, torn, or frayed. And it's also the proper tension. When I push or pull on that belt, there's no more than 3/4 of an inch of play. And then you'll mention that the alternator here is securely mounted. While you're over here, you'll mention the condition of this hose right here. You'll mention that it's tied up because that feeds the water pump and cools the motor right here and goes right down to the radiator down over here. So you'll mention that there's no loose or missing clamps at all. It's tied up securely. There's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. It's not cracked or leaking at all. And then you'll point out that all these other lines and hoses, they're too tied up. They're not loose at all. There's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. They're not cracked or leaking at all. The electrical lines too, they're all secured and tied up. They're not going to get caught on any hot parts at all. And there's no corroded, exposed, or loose wires at all. And then while you're over here, you'll point out a few things down below. You might say that I'm going to look over here just to make sure there's nothing leaking over here at all. By the washer fluid, nothing's leaking there at all. And the container is attached. The cap is tight. It's not loose. The seal there is not cracked or leaking. The container is not cracked or leaking. Also, that electrical line is securely tied up. It's not loose at all. It's also plugged in. No cut or exposed wires at all. And then you'll talk about the fact that there's no leaking or dripping on the ground or on any parts at all underneath the engine compartments, and nothing's leaking or dripping underneath where the transmission is either. And as you walk around, you'll squat over this way down below, and you'll point out that you'll look underneath the engine compartment too as well to make sure there's nothing dripping or leaking from the radiator. Nothing's puddling or pooling on the ground underneath the engine compartment at all, or nothing's dripping at all. And also nothing's dripping or leaking underneath the transmission at all. So now we're over here at the engine compartment, and we got a few things to point out. First, here you have your oil dipstick, and then the fill cap is up on top right there. Your power steering fluid is right here, and your coolant is right here. And then you have your steering shaft, your steering box, your pitman arm, and drag link. You got all these hoses right here. Here at the brake line, you have these fittings up here and here at the chamber. Here at the chamber, you have this C-clamp, and you have the two ends. You have the push rod, some pins and cotter keys. You have the slack adjuster. And then up there, you got your brake components, your drum, and your linings, your shock, your mounts, your springs, your U-bolts. And deep inside here, you'll have your air compressor right here. And the line comes up this way. And then these air lines feed fluid right here, and also air. Certainly the red here and the blue line, they feed air to the truck and also to the trailer. So anyway, so starting with the leaks and stuff, carry on with that. So I'm going to look down on the ground to make sure there's nothing leaking or dripping on the ground at all. Over here at all. Nothing's leaking or dripping from the shock at all. And these hoses right here, they're attached to the steering box and also to the power steering container. There's no loose or missing clamps at all. The metal's not bent, broken, or cracked. They're all tied up. They're not loose at all. There's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts, and these rubber lines are not cracked or leaking at all. The container itself is attached to. It's not sagging or loose at all. There's no out of round holes here at all, which indicates that could have been loose. The cap's on tight. It's not cracked or leaking at all. And then up here on the coolant, you'll mention that the container too is not cracked or leaking at all. There's no loose or missing hose clamp at all. There's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. It's not cracked or leaking at all. And there's nothing cracked or leaking up here at all. So starting with the power steering fluid, you'll mention that I'm going to check this while the engine is off. You can do that on the manuals. On the automatics, you'll check it while it's running. And there's a min line and a max line up here. If it's below that cold or min line, you'll add it here while the engine's running. The cap is not loose, not cracked or leaking at all. Also here on the menu though, you can add it when the engine is off too as well. So then the cool disc right here, they'll mention that you're going to inspect it to make sure it's above this add line and certainly below the max line here. And you're going to check this when the engine's off and cool. And if you had to add it, you're going to add it up here at the cap. The cap is tight. The seal is not cracked or leaking at all. And if you hadn't mentioned it, you'll talk about the container itself, that it's secured to the truck. It's not cracked or leaking at all. Now we'll check the oil level. You'll mention that this is the oil level right here, the oil level. You'll check that while the engine's off. And then you'll explain how you'll check it. You're just going to remove that dipstick, wipe it clean, reinsert it, pull it back out. It should be above the fill and not below the add line. If it were low, up there at the top at that oil cap, that's where I'm going to add oil. The cap's not loose. The seal's not cracked or leaking at all. The cap's here, there, and also here, all securely mounted. While you're up here too, I know it seems like you're kind of jumping around, but you'll mention that there's nothing leaking on the top of the motor here, nothing leaking over here by the radiator at all. You'll inspect that. When you do talk about the air compressor, you'll mention that this air compressor right here is gear driven. It's attached to the truck. There's no missing nuts or bolts. Also, the metal's not cracked, bent, or dented. And the feeder line right here too as well is intact. The fitting there is tight. It's not loose, cracked, or leaking at all. And all these hoses and wires, all the fittings there too are tight. None of them are loose, cracked, or leaking at all. And the hoses too there's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. They're not cracked or leaking at all. And obviously all the electrical stuff is plugged in, and there's no indication that there is an exposed wire or anything else to cause any shorts. So now we'll talk about the steering components here. So starting with this is the steering shaft right here. The steering shaft is straight. It's not bent, broken, or cracked at all. And then you'll mention that it's not loose at all. There's no more than 3/4 of an inch of play. I'm sorry, there's no more than 10 degrees of play right here, or 2 inches at the steering wheel up there. And then you'll mention that the steering box right here, the gearbox right here is tight to the frame. It's not twisted, sagging, or loose. These holes here are not out of round. There's no gap between this bracket and the frame at all. You also mentioned that the steering box itself is not bent, broken, or cracked, or leaking at all. You don't want to see that at all. And if you hadn't gotten to it, then you can talk about these hoses too. That's another way to look at it. The hoses are attached. There's no loose or missing clamps at all. And there's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. These are not cracked or leaking. And then you'll talk about the pitman arm. The pitman arm is not bent, broken, or cracked at all. It's also Minnesota, so it's not rusted through anywhere at all. And then there's no missing castle nut or cotter key here at all. And then you'll follow the drag link right here. You'll mention that that's not cracked, bent, or dented at all. And then there's no missing castle nut or cotter key here at all. And then you'll say that it's properly greased at its bushings right here. And then also right there and up here. And also properly greased right here. So that takes care of the steering components. And now we can move on to either we could choose to move on to the suspension and work our way out, or we can start from the tire and work our way in. So I'm just going to start with the suspension since it's open and exposed here. So I'll just start right here. So this is my spring mount right here. I have some springs. I got U-bolts. I got a shock. And I'm going to follow those springs all the way to the back here. I mentioned that there's some springs right here too as well. I'm spring mounts and springs. Starting with the spring mounts, I have spring mounts right up here in the front, and then I have spring mounts there in the back. They're tight to the frame. There's no gaps or out of round holes. The metal's not cracked, bent, or dented or rusted through anywhere at all. And also inside here, we have a bushing. That bushing is in place. It's not loose or missing at all. The springs, they're straight. They're not scissoring one another. They're on top of one another. None are missing at all. The metal's not cracked, bent, or dented or rusted through anywhere at all. It's held to the axle here with these U-bolts. The U-bolts are right here and right here. They're not loose, not twisted or sagging at all. There's no gap between here and this bracket right here at all. And there's no missing nuts or bolts or shiny exposed threads at the U-bolts at all. Now we'll talk about the shock. Here, there's no missing nuts or bolts here or up here, shiny exposed threads. This bracket's tight to the frame. There's no out of round hole at all or any gaps between the bracket and the frame at all. The rubber bushings up here and also down here are not worn through or missing at all. And the metal here is not rusted through at all. It's not cracked, bent, or dented at all. And the shock is securely mounted. So now we'll talk about, because we're working our way out here, we'll talk about the brake component. So the brake fittings right here. So we have a fitting for this hose right here. We have a fitting that comes up to the chamber here. So I'm going to talk about the fittings first to make sure they're all tight. They're not loose or cracked or leaking at all. The hose itself, there's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. It's not cracked or leaking at all. And also the this ABS line that goes like this up here, all the way down to the tire there. It's securely tied up. It's not loose. It's not going to get tangled up or cut off or anything. There's no cuts or exposed or loose wires at all. The ABS line and the brake hose here are securely mounted. And you might also mention that when there's air in the system, you're going to chock the tires and listen for any air leaks. So here we have the brake chamber here, the front brake chamber. So we have the back and the front here, and also the C-clamp, and it's attached to this bracket right here. And then we have some mounting hardware here. We have the push rod that comes in here. We have these cotter keys, and we have the slack adjuster, and obviously the bracket right here. So starting with the brake chamber, we have the front and the back and the C-clamp. They'll mention that the C-clamp is tight. It's not loose. The metal's not cracked, bent, or dented at all. And the brake chamber itself is not cracked, bent, or dented. There's no leaks at all when there's air in the system here. I'll check for leaks there. Also, there's no missing nuts or bolts right here at all. This bracket too, it's not cracked, bent, or dented or rusted through anywhere at all. There's no out of round holes, which might indicate that maybe this chamber might have been loose or whatever. And then the push rod goes into the brake chamber straight. So it too is not cracked, bent, or dented. It's not going to get bound up in this thing when the brakes are applied. And when I pull this push rod by hand, there should be no more than 1 inch of play. And it should be even on both sides of the truck. The slack adjuster is adhered to the push rod with these pins and cotter keys, so there's no loose or missing pins or cotter keys at all. Here at the bushing, here it's properly greased. The metal here is not cracked, bent, or dented. There's no missing nuts or bolts at all. And it's also tight to this bracket here. It's not sagging or loose at all. So the slack adjuster, push rod, brake chamber, and the bracket here are all securely mounted, including the C-clamp too as well. So now we'll talk about the brake drum here and also the linings inside here. You're going to inspect the brake drum both on the outside and the inside to make sure there's no illegal welds. On the inside here, you're going to make sure it's clean and dry. There's no oil or grease at all. Also, there's no debris such as, broken brake pad or lining at all. And there's no signs of overheating like warping or any sign of discoloration, which would indicate that you had overheating or potential brake fade. And then we want to look at the lining here. We want to make sure that the lining is not worn dangerously thin or too thin. So if you can't say dangerously, you can say that it's not worn dangerously thin. It's at least a 1/4 inch thick. And it's evenly worn all the way around. None of it's loose or missing, and the linings themselves are dry, no oil or grease. So then we'll walk out this way and we'll talk about the tire itself. You'll mention that you'll inspect where the tire meets the rim here to make sure there's no exposed bead at all, which might indicate this tire wasn't properly seated or coming loose in some weird way, or maybe it wasn't properly inflated, so the bead starts to expose itself. And then you'll talk about the fact that there's no exposed bead here at all. We'll talk about the sidewalls here, the tread depth here, and the sidewalls here. So starting with the sidewalls, you'll mention that there's no exposed belts or threads at all. There's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. It's not leaking here on the inside, and it's properly seated to the rim. There's no exposed bead. Here at the tread, this is a steer tire, so it cannot be recapped. This has to be a virgin tire, and it is. The tread depth is not worn too thin. It's at least 4/32 deep and evenly worn all the way around. There's no thin or flat spots at all. And then the sidewall here, there's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts at all. It's not cracked or leaking at all. And then I'm going to read the spec on the tire. And with an air gauge, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my tire is properly inflated, because my tires cannot be under or overinflated. And I'm going to check that here at the valve stem with a tire gauge. That valve stem is not obstructed. It's not hidden anywhere at all. It's clearly visible. It's not cracked or leaking or loose, and the dust cap's in place. These tires here are securely mounted. Now I'm going to inspect the rims, both inside and out here, to make sure that there's no illegal welds at all. The metal's not warped at all. It's not cracked, bent, or dented. And also here where the lugs and the lug nuts meet the rim, there's no sign that the rim was loose at all, like any oblong or out of round holes at all. I don't want to see any of that. The rim here is securely mounted. Now we'll talk about the lugs and the lug nuts here. There's no loose or missing lug nuts or lugs at all. They're not broken or cracked at all. There's no shiny threads at all. There's no metal shavings at all. There's no gaps between these lug nuts and the rim. They're all tight to the rim. You can mention that there's no rust trails, or better yet, you'd probably look to make sure there's no out of round holes. And that takes care of the lug nuts and the lugs. So now we'll talk about the hub oil seal here. So the hub oil seal, the seal is intact. It's not worn through, cracked, or leaking at all. It's secured to the truck here with these 4 bolts at all. And this cap is not cracked, bent, or dented. And there's no sign that it's been leaking at all inside the rim here, or on the rim over here, or anywhere on the ground. So that takes care of the tires, and it takes care of everything in the engine compartment here. And if you felt like you might have missed something, then you could always go back to it at this point. You could say things like, I might smell for any burnt plastic or rubber to make sure that nothing's loose or nothing's burning. Or you could smell hot fluids on hot parts and so on. Those would be good indicators too as well that something's not right here. So that's kind of a good idea, just to kind of go back to where you kind of came from to make sure you didn't miss anything inside there. There's a lot of things that could probably go wrong on the inside. So you're just going to check everything and kind of come up with a system, whether you decide to work from the inside out, top to bottom, side to side. So you'll have to kind of sort that out just so you don't miss anything on the engine compartment. So now we're going to talk about the driver's door and the fuel area. And then also that rear axle, the frames, the battery box, the steps, and so on. So starting with the driver's door, you're going to show the examiner that this door opens correctly. The latch works here. It also works here too as well. And then you'll point out that these hinges right here and down there, they're attached. There's no gap at all. The metal's not cracked, bent, or dented or rusted through anywhere at all. And then you'll grab the bottom here, kind of lightly mention that this door is not sagging or loose. And then you'll point out that the seal, this rubber seal, the door seal, is intact. It's not cut or torn or loose or missing at all. It's securely mounted. And then you'll close the door and mention that the door securely latches and it's flush with the body of the truck and securely mounted. So if you hadn't gotten to the mirrors, this would be a good time to mention the mirrors right here and also right here. And since we've already did that on the front of the vehicle, we don't have to do that right here at all. So, and you can also talk about the condition of the glass here or save that for the in-cab. So now we'll talk about the steps. So looking at these steps here, there's proper ground clearance right here and right here. They're not hanging too low. There's enough room for the road. Also, they're not twisted or sagging at all. The metal's not rusted through anywhere at all. It's not crack bent or dented at all. These brackets here and right here, they're not bent or twisted at all. There's no broken or missing welds at all or missing nuts or bolts at all. And there's even traction on all of the steps. So I want to see nice even traction on them. And also there's no debris, you know, such as rocks or mud if it's springtime or summer, or snow or ice in the winter, or anything else that you might see to cause a trip hazard. Example right here, if I were exiting out the store, maybe the glove would be considered a trip hazard, so I'll remove that. But anyway, that's me trying to be funny. So anyway, so now we'll talk about the fuel tank right here. So this fuel tank is secured to the truck with these two metal straps right here. You'll mention that the hoses and the electrical lines up there. They'll mention this little rubber piece right here, and then the tank itself and all these welds and the cap and the seal and the safety chain and so on. So starting with the fuel tank is not cracked, dented, or leaking at all. The straps right here are not loose or twisted or there's no missing nuts or bolts at all. The metal's not cracked, bent, or dented at all. There's no broken or missing welds on this tank at all. It's also secured to the body of the truck. It's not sagging one way or the other. And then these hoses right here, the hoses, they're attached to the tank. The fittings are tight, not loose, not cracked or leaking. The hoses, too, are securely tied up here. They're not loose or dragging anywhere at all. There's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. They're not cracked or leaking at all. This electrical line, too, is plugged in right here. It's not disconnected. There's no cut or exposed wires at all. And then I would check for any leaks up here in the top and around all these welds right here. The metal straps right here and right here, there's this component right here, this rubber piece right here and right here. It's present and clearly visible. I don't have metal rubbing on metal anywhere at all. And then the fuel cap right here, the fuel cap is tight. It's not loose at all. I would loosen that cap to make sure the gas cap seal's in place and the safety chain is there. It's also not leaking anywhere at all. And it's also not leaking or dripping on the ground anywhere at all. The fuel tank here is securely mounted. And you could mention that the DEF tank too, it's secured to the truck. It's not sagging or hanging down loose at all. The metal's not cracked, bent, or dented or rusted through anywhere at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts at all. The tank itself is not cracked or leaking at all. This cap is on tight. That seal's in place. It's not worn through or leaking at all. The safety chain is there. And then also these hoses are securely tied up. And the electrical lines are plugged in. They're not disconnected. There's no cut or exposed wires. There's these feeder lines too as well. For the DEF tank, there's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts at all. And all those fittings are tight. They're not loose, cracked, or leaking at all. The DEF tank is securely mounted. So we're kind of almost there. So now we're working over here to the battery box. So the battery box is right here. So you'll mention that the battery box is secured to the frame. It's not sagging in one direction or the other. There's no gap between the battery box and the frame, no noticeable gap there at all, or any out of round holes at all. The metal's not rusted through. There's no rust holes at all. The metal's not bent, broken, or cracked at all. These rubber straps right here on this side, And also this side right here, they're clearly attached. They're locked right now. I would remove this cap too as well to make sure that the batteries are securely strapped down. They're not loose. They're not going to bang around at all. They're not bulging, cracked, or leaking at all. Also, all the electrical lines, they're all tight. None of them are loose at all. And there's no cuts or exposed wires or any sign of excessive corrosion on the inside. The batteries and the battery box are securely mounted. So now we'll talk about the frame of the truck. So the frame of the truck right here, we'll kind of come back here and mention first that it's nice and level with the ground. It's not twisted or sagging anywhere at all. The metal back here, all the way along here, it's straight. It's not twisted or sagging or bent anywhere at all. All these cross members here, right here, there, up here, and underneath the vehicle, right here, are all securely mounted. There's no missing nuts or bolts or no signs that they've come loose at all, any round holes. Also, you inspect all these bolts to make sure that they're all secured and tight. None of them are loose or missing at all. And then you inspect the metal to make sure there's no illegal welds on the inside of the frame here at all or any rust holes at all. And you'd mentioned that everything on the frame here is securely mounted and ready for the roads. You could talk about the cab shock right here too, that it's straight, it's not bent, rusted through. The bushings on top and bottom are not worn through or missing at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts at all. And it too is securely mounted. All right. So now we're going to get to the drive axle right here. So when you talk about the drive axle, you're going to talk about the dually tires down here. You're going to talk about all the brake components on the inside here that go to the inside of the frame here, and the spring mount right here, the bushing, the springs, the airbag mounts top and bottom, the springs there, the U-bolts right there. So starting with the spring mounts right here and the airbag mounts right here and down there. You'll mention that those are tight to the frame. They're not twisted or sagging at all. There's no out of round holes or sizable gaps at all. The metal's not cracked, bent, or dented at all. And the spring mounts and airbag mounts are securely mounted. The bushing down here is intact. It's not loose at all or worn through at all. It too is securely mounted. And then the springs too are straight. They're not bent or twisted or sagging at all. If you had two of them here, you'd say they're not twisted. They're not scissoring one another. And then you can talk about the U-bolts right here. Coming back here, so the U-bolts right here and here, they're not twisted or sagging at all. There's no gap between these U-bolts and where they seat up here at all. And there's also, you inspect down below to make sure there's no loose or missing nuts at all for those U-bolts. The metal's not cracked, bent, or dented at all. The U-bolts here are securely mounted. And then the airbag mount right here and down below, you'd mentioned that it's tight to the frame. It's not cracked, bent, or dented at all. There's no gap or out of round holes, or the bag itself is not twisted in one direction or the other. It's nice and straight. The metals, there's also no gap between the mount up here and the bag here at all. And they mentioned that the spring mount, the airbag mount right here and also the airbag mounts down there are all securely mounted. And then you'll talk about the airbags themselves. We'll say the airbags, there's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts, not cracked or leaking. And also they're evenly inflated from this side to that side right there. So they're not unevenly inflated, sagging in one direction or the other. And then you'll mention that all these hoses right here and fittings are connected. None of them are loose. None of them are cracked or leaking at all. There's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. And these lines are not cracked or leaking at all. They're also securely tied up to the truck right here. They're not hanging down below the truck to get caught up on anything. So notice that I talked about the suspension kind of working this way, and then I pointed out some hoses and fittings right here. You can save that for later. You can just address it as you're walking along. Since you're pointing over to the airbag over here, for me, it just kind of makes sense to do that so I don't miss it as I'm going along. Once more, I'm just trying to, as I'm flying along here doing my pre-trip, I want to start one direction, kind of work my way to the other. Or if I'm starting up in the front, I want to work my way to the back and so on. So, all right. So that takes care of the suspension for the most part back here. But as you're going back through here, after you get through these airlines and fittings and connectors, you're going to want to mention these shocks on the inside right here and also right there. They'll mention that they're not rusted through at all. The metal's not bent, broken, or cracked at all. The bushings on the top and the bottom are there. They're present. They're not worn through or missing at all. The brackets to the frame are tight. They're not twisted or in one direction or the other at all. There's no gap between the bracket and the body of the truck. It's not rusted through anywhere at all. The shock is securely mounted. And you may want to mention, too, that there's oil on these shocks, so they're not cracked or leaking at all, if you hadn't mentioned that. So now we'll get to the working our way from the inside out. We're going to get to some brake components here. So starting here on the inside here, you're going to talk about the brake chamber. The brake chamber right here, these hoses, the ABS line, all the fittings, the brake chamber, the bracket, slack adjuster, and push rod. So starting with the slack adjuster here, the slack adjuster here is not bent, broken, or cracked. The bushings are properly greased. There's no missing pins or cotter keys at the push rod at all. This bracket that holds all this right here, the slack adjuster, and also the brake chamber here, it's not twisted or bent at all. There's no out of round holes. The metal's not rusted through anywhere at all. And then you'll mention that this push rod right here, you're going to check the adjustment right here. And to do that here, you're going to have to block or chock these tires and then release the tractor brake or the parking brake. And then you can actually pull that push rod by hand. So when you pull those push rods by hand, there should be no more than 1 inch of play, and it should be even on both sides of the truck. Now we'll talk about the brake chamber right here. The brake chamber has a centerpiece and a sealed cap up here, and also a C-clamp and the back cap back this way. So you'll mention that the metal here is not cracked, bent, or dented at all. The C-clamp is in place. It's not twisted, sagging, or loose. There's no missing nuts or bolts at all here, or where it meets the bracket, there's no missing nuts or bolts there at all, or any out around holes or gaps or shiny threads at all. The brake chamber too is not leaking. I would check that when there's air in there to make sure it's not leaking at all. And you would mention that the brake chamber, this bracket, the slack adjuster, and push rod are securely mounted. And if you thought that you missed it, you'd say there was no missing pins or cotter keys here at the push rod. Don't forget those. And then we'll talk about the hoses here that go into the brake chamber here and up here at the supply and the governors. So you'll mention that the fittings are all tight. None of them are loose, cracked, or leaking at all. You're going to listen for air leaks around the fittings. And then the hoses too, there's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. They're not cracked or leaking at all. The hoses here and the fittings are all securely mounted. And this ABS line too is securely attached to the truck. It's not hanging down low to get caught up in anything. There's no cut or exposed wires at all. The ABS line too is securely mounted. And then you'll talk about all these fittings up here to make sure that they're all attached. They're not loose, cracked, or leaking at all. All the hoses and stuff here are all securely tied up to the body of the truck. They're not hanging below the frame to get caught up in anything. And then you'll kind of work your way out this way to the drums and linings. So right here, we have the outside of the drum, and there's the inside of the drum right here. So you're going to talk about, I'm going to inspect the outside and the inside of the drum to make sure there's no illegal welds. Also, you're going to look in the inside of the drum. You'll tell the examiner that it's dry and clean inside there. There's no oil or grease. It has to be dry in there, no oil or grease. The oil and grease part's the most important part. Obviously, you don't want to start a fire or anything. And then you want to mention that on the inside of the frame, there's no signs of warping or overheating at all. There's no sizable cracks that half the distance of the drum or more. And then you can talk about the linings themselves. You'll mention that the linings themselves, they're at least a 1/4 inch thick and evenly worn all the way around. None of it's loose or missing, broken or cracked at all, and they too are dry. No oil or grease on them. And the linings and the brake drum here are securely mounted. Now we're going to talk about tires. So we did all the brakes there. Now we'll talk about these tires right here. So the tires, you have the sidewalls, and then you have the tread here. You have the bud spacing, the rims, the lug nuts, the grease seal around this cap right here. So starting with the tires themselves, you'll mention that I'm going to inspect the tires both inside and out here to make sure first they're the same size and type of tire. I cannot have mismatched sizes or types. I'm going to inspect the sidewalls to make sure that there's no exposed belts or threads at all. I don't want to see that. And then these tires can be recapped. I want to make sure if they were recapped that there's no sign that this tread was coming loose at all. And then I will inspect the tread depth to make sure that it's at least 2/32 deep. It's not worn too thin anywhere at all. It's also evenly worn. There's no flat spots at all or thin spots at all. And then I'm going to read the spec on the tire to make sure that my tires are properly inflated. They're not under or overinflated at all. And then I'm going to check for proper inflation with a tire gauge. You got the valve stems right here and also up there. So the valve stems are clearly visible. The fittings there, they're tight, they're not loose, they're not cracked or leaking at all. The dust caps are in place. And then once more, like I said, you're going to check for proper inflation with a tire gauge. So not a mallet or a hammer or your foot. That's not a way to properly check a tire. So now we'll talk about the rims themselves. You'll inspect the rims, all the rims here, inside and out, to make sure there's no illegal welds. The metal is not cracked, bent, or dented at all, or warped at all. There's no exposed beads at all where the tires meet the rim at all. And here at these lug and lug nuts, there's no out of round holes at all. If you saw out of round holes, that could mean that the rim was loose at one time. And then you'll mention that then you'll come around this way and you'll talk about the bud spacing here. So the bud spacing right here, these rims are tight together. There's no gap or sizable space between these two rims at all. You also mentioned that there's no illegal welds on the inside of here at all, and the metal's not cracked, bent, or dented at all. And they mentioned something about the beads here and there. Make sure there's no exposed beads where the tire meets the rim at all. And you would do the same here on the inside of the tire. So on the inside of the tire, inspecting that rim, make sure that there's no illegal welds, the metal's not cracked, bent, or dented, no exposed bead. And then you'd mention that the rims are securely mounted. And then you come back and talk about this bud spacing. You'll say that you have the appropriate amount of space between these two tires. These tires are not rubbing or touching anywhere at all. Also, these rims are tight together. There's no space or gap between the two rims or any daylight. You don't want to see that. And also, there's nothing stuck in between them to cause any damage or a puncture or a fire. And then you'd mention the bud spacing here is securely mounted. Now we'll talk about lugs and lug nuts. You'll mention that the lugs and the lug nuts, None of them are loose or missing. None of them are broken or cracked at all. There's no gap between the lug nuts and the rim. All these lug nuts are tight to the rim. You can mention rust trails. And they can also mention that there's no shiny threads at all on the lugs or any metal shavings on the inside here. And you mentioned that all these lugs and lug nuts are all securely mounted. Now we'll talk about the hub oil seal here. So you'll mention that the seal is intact. It's not cracked or leaking at all. There's nowhere on the inside of the rim or any indication that it had been leaking at all. You would see it inside here. And then you'd mention that the metal's not cracked, bent, or dented at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts here at all. They're all secured and tight. No shiny threads at all. The hub oil seal is securely mounted. So now we're going to talk about under the vehicle, the drive shaft and the exhaust and the frame. So starting with the drive shaft, you'll mention that this drive shaft is straight. It's also securely attached to the hanger bearing there. That hanger bearing, this bracket is attached to the truck. It's not sagging or loose at all. It's also properly greased up there, and also at its couplings right here and back there. The metal here is not rusted through anywhere at all. It's not cracked, bent, or dented at all. And because the drive shaft spins, they'll mention that all these hoses and wires are all securely tied up to the body of the truck. They're not hanging below the frame or too close to the drive shaft to get tangled up in it. And then once more, here's another look at the hanger bearing. And then you'll mention that there's no missing nuts or bolts at all. And it's all securely mounted. So now we'll talk about the exhaust system. So we have the muffler there, the pipe, the brackets, and so on. So you'll mention that the metal's not rusted through anywhere at all. There's no rust holes at all. The brackets too, there's no missing nuts or bolts. The exhaust pipe here and the muffler, it's not sagging on the ground or twisted anywhere at all. And also there's no gaps or signs that my exhaust has been leaking at all, like any soot buildup. And also the end of the exhaust extends beyond the cab of the truck. It's not underneath the cab to make me sick or anything. So now we'll talk about the frame of the truck. Much like you did when you were talking about the frame and so on, when you were at the front of the truck, you'll mention that it's not twisted or sagging anywhere at all. It's nice and level with the grounds. You'll inspect the metal both inside and out to make sure there's no illegal welds or any rust holes. It's not rusted through anywhere at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts at all, or any out of round holes or any misplaced nuts or bolts. They're all secured and tight. There's no loose or missing cross members at all. I don't want to see that. They're not twisted or sagging at all. And you'll say everything on the frame is secured and tight. It's securely mounted and also ready for the road. All right. So now we'll talk about just the back of the truck right here. And we'll talk about the mud flaps and the lights and the DOT tape here and also on the glass right there. So starting with the mud flaps are attached to the truck with this bracket and bar right here. It's tight to the frame. It's not ajar. It's also got a spring to it, so the spring is not missing at all. It's not going to come or fly away at all. The metal's not cracked, bent, or dented at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts at all. There's DOT approved tape right here and also right there and on the glass right here. So it's all adhered and it's fixed. It's DOT approved. It's clean, clear, not obstructed, and securely mounted. And then you'll talk about the mud flap here. The mud flap right there is properly elevated off the ground, at least 6 to 9 inches, but mainly this thing just can't be dragging on the ground at all. So it's not dragging on the ground at all. The rubber too is adhered with these nuts and bolts. There's no missing nuts or bolts at all. And it's not torn or cracked or loose at all. And the mud flap here is securely mounted. And then you'll talk about all these lights. So the lights right here, you might mention the reflector right here. And the lights and reflectors back here are all securely mounted. There's the brackets here and the bar right here. It's not twisted, sagging, or loose at all. It's not rusted through anywhere at all. There's no broken or missing welds. It's not cracked, bent, or dented at all. The lenses themselves, and also there, the reflectors, they're all clean and clear, not cracked at all. None of them are loose or missing. No missing nuts or bolts or screws at all. They're all securely mounted. And then you'd make sure that there was no loose or missing bulbs at all. And then you'll mention something about all these electrical lines. They're plugged in and attached. They're not loose. They're also tied up. They're not going to come loose or come unplugged at all. And there's no cut or exposed wires at all. Those two are securely mounted. So, like I said, so we've done, you know, like we've done the driver's door and fuel area. There's a lot there that if you were to overlook, you could overlook a lot of things. I mean, so this memory guide doesn't do a good job by spelling everything out. So, but we've helped you out because we've created one for you. We have a guide here that lists everything out, the key components that you want to check. And then also, if you're someone that has a hard time with words, we actually spell it out for you too on the inside. So when you come here at Class A, you'll get a copy of this, and then also a copy of a list. So the list is just meant for a study guide for the purpose of your test. The examiners are only going to give you a memory guide like this to work from. So like I said, for Wisconsin, there's a lot to remember, but if you come up with a system of kind of working yourself in and out when you're on the different profiles of the truck, or when you're kind of looking inside the frame and out, you should be able to hit everything that you need to. But once more, you have this memory aid just to kind of look back to, which, like I said, it doesn't tell you a whole lot. So you really have to kind of think about what it is that you're saying, and you really got to practice or rehearse this pre-trip. So we do have a study guide that goes along with this, that's behind this, and I showed that at the beginning of the video. So I encourage you to read that through. That'll get you there, and also watching these videos, that'll get you there too as well. And then the greater 60% is you just rehearsing it and practicing it. So if you don't do that, you're not going to be very successful.